1995 through 1997 Ford F-Series truck with a 7.3 Powerstroke. We are going to be replacing the fuel lift pump, which is down here in the valley, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So if you have a fuel leak and you've got fuel in the engine valley, kind of right down here behind the fuel pump, the way you can identify if your lift pump is leaking is have an assistant raise the engine RPM, and you will see fuel squirting out either towards the back or towards the front of this fuel pump when the diaphragm ruptures. There's a couple other things that can leak in here, and I'll show you those when we get it apart. Okay, so I'm using a 1/4" drive screw gun here. You don't have to have this, you can do this by hand. There's 3 clamps to get this center piece out. Now the trick when you're doing this is on the turbo clamp here, there is an O-ring seal. Don't drop your socket. There's a seal inside of here that you want to make sure you don't lose or drop. And then to get this piece out, we're just going to kind of shoehorn off to one side and then lift up and out. And this piece comes out. But this little guy right here, this is important. If you lose that, you'll have problems. So don't lose that. The next step is going to be to remove the fuel bowl. There are 2 fuel lines here. These are going to be 9/16 on these 2 nuts, and they just thread off. And then there's a hose that goes to the drain valve on this kind of front left corner. This one has a clamp on it from the factory. There's not a clamp down there, but some people put clamps on them. And then there's a hose clamp on this vertical hose right here. We're taking the left hose off and the bottom hose off. And to do that, we're going to use a long extension with a 1/4" drive socket. So it's typically easier when you're doing this to take off the clamp on the pump side. So we're taking off the clamp on the left side pump, and then we got to go straight down into the valley to get the clamp at the bottom. If you're doing this and you're planning to replace the hoses and the clamp is not pointed correctly, you can reach down here with like a knife and just cut the bottom hose and then put a new hose on it, obviously, when you get in to do the repair. So bottom hose, left hose, and then this one vertical hose right here by the fuel pressure regulator has to come off as well. So typically what I do is I'll loosen up the hose clamp there, and then I will take a pair of pliers and just kind of gently give it a little bit of a twist to break the seal so that it comes out a little bit easier. In this case, we are not replacing the clamps, so we want to be careful to not damage them. I do have a clamp on the drain valve hose, so I'm going to go ahead and take that off. Again, same application, long 1/4" extension with a 1/4" drive, 1/4" socket, and we're just going to spin that clamp off and then just kind of wiggle it a little bit there. And that's that. There's an electrical connection on this left side. My lock tab is broken, but if you just unplug this guy, that unplugs all the electrical wiring that goes to this assembly, and that's the only connection that you have to unplug. The next step is going to be these 2 9/16 fuel lines, which can be a little snug. You got to be careful on these trucks as they're getting older. The rubber on these soft lines is getting more stiff, so we want to be careful to not bend or kink those hoses any more than we absolutely have to get them off. So I just pull it off and kind of let it sit there. Be careful, obviously there are sensors around here that you don't want to hit with your wrench and brake. Typically once you get the nut broken loose, you can just use your fingers and spin it off. They shouldn't be tight. And again, we're just going to push that hose down so that it's disconnected. We're not going to bend it or try to twist it out of the way at all. So at this point, all of the connections have been disconnected from the assembly. So we're going to go ahead and unbolt it. There are 2 13mm bolts that go straight down. Again, just a long extension and a 13mm socket. And that's what that bolt looks like. There's 2 of these. Don't lose them. They're important. But there are only 2 in the front. There's nothing, or there's 2 towards the back of the bowl on the side of the fuel pump. There's no other bolts that hold this thing in place. You can see the whole fuel bowl starting to move there as I'm twisting on it. bolt's a little dirtier, so it's a little more work to come out, but that's all there is to it, is these 2 bolts. And then once the bolts are out, I'm gonna lift up slightly, push down on this hose, and then we're gonna try to kind of shoehorn back to pop the bottom hose off. So there's bottom hose disconnected. I'm gonna pull up and back a little bit. There's the top hose. We are gonna leak some fuel, so make sure you've got a drain pan underneath the vehicle to catch this. I'm gonna wiggle this a little bit more to encourage it to come off. We're just wiggling and pushing on this line. Yeah, it's a little tight. We might need to loosen that up just a fuzz nut more. Okay, so once that's loosened, that'll pop off, and then we got to pop off the drain valve. The IPR connection, which is your high pressure oil regulator, pigtail is part of it, so you do have to unplug that when you lift this thing out. And this is what that assembly looks like coming out. This little barb here that we were hanging up on, so make sure your clamp is loose enough. These do have a known issue where sediment builds up in the bottom, and you can get a pinhole that leaks out through the aluminum casting. If that happens, there's not really a good fix other than replacement, but these are getting harder to find. So if you've got a good one, just change your fuel filter regularly, and when you do your fuel filter, make sure you clean the sediment out of the bottom of the water separator. So this is the lift pump. It is possible to get this out without removing the fuel bowl, but with the fuel bowl removed, as you can see, we have much better access. So typically we'll see a leak around the crimp at the top, or there's a weep hole underneath that will spray fuel out as well. But you can see there's pooled fuel in the valley. Some of that is because we just spilled it, but this pump has been leaking for a while. So as you can see, this hose here does go to the fuel pump, but you don't have to take it out to get the fuel bowl out. So the next thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna take this hose off of the fuel pump, and then there is a 1.25 inch banjo bolt on the back that we have to get out, and that's the real challenging part of this repair. And again, just using a 1/4 inch socket to loosen that hose clamp. There's a little bit of give in this hard line, so you can just kind of pull it back and push it to the side like that, and then it's out of your way for when you go to pull the pump out. So this is the special tool that you need to get this job done. This wrench, as you can see, I've bent a little bit of an offset into it. This is a 1.25 inch wrench. This is a Husky brand. This bend makes it much easier to use this tool. It is possible to do this job with this wrench without bending it. I've done it before on this truck 8 years ago without bending the wrench, but bending the wrench makes it easier. So if you have a torch and you have a way to put this little offset into it, that will make your life easier, but it's not a requirement. It is possible to do it without that. So this just goes onto the banjo bolt on the back of the lift pump. We're gonna set it on. And this bolt should be pretty tight, so expect to expend some effort, a lot of effort, to get it to come loose. I'm gonna go to the other side and try pulling on it. I'm not as tall as I once was. So typically once it breaks loose, again, same thing with those fuel lines. It's not going to be super tight to unscrew from there. I'll probably do a couple of spins out with the wrench before I switch to just my hands. You can see it a lot better if you approach it from the passenger side of the vehicle. And with this bend in the wrench, I'm able to clear this turbo pedestal a little bit better. The other thing that you can do is you can notch this pedestal, because this little bit of webbing is just for structure. It doesn't do anything as far as oil flow. So that is an option that'll give you a little more room if you need it. The bent wrench is the way to go, but if you don't have a way to bend it, there's other ways around it. Now, I should point out at this point, this repair is only possible without removing the turbo on a federal emissions 7.3. The California emissions have a longer banjo bolt, and there's a fuel dampener that sits back in here, and you have to take the turbo out to get it out. So if you see a big round disc underneath your turbo, you can't do this job without pulling the turbo. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just reaching back with 2 fingers, and I'm just kind of working this bolt, and I'm unscrewing it slowly. There are 2 flat washer seals that are gonna come out when we take this apart. You don't really need to worry about them right now, but we are gonna have to worry about them when we go back together, because without those seals, this will leak. And obviously the point of this repair is to not have it leak. You always want to get this bolt out before you take the pump loose, because if the bolt's pretty tight and you'll bend the fuel lines, but this way the hard fuel lines going into the back of this pump will just stay in place and it should line up when we put the new pump in, which makes the repair a little bit easier. You can kind of start to see the edge of the bolt as we're starting to back it out. We probably have a few more threads here and then it'll be free. So now we've got the banjo bolt out of the back. We've got all the lines off the front. We've got the lines off the top. The only thing that's still holding this in is the two 10mm bolts going straight down. So when you do this, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take each one loose and we're gonna go about a half a turn out of each bolt, and we're expecting this pump to sort of pop up a little bit. There's some spring pressure underneath holding it up, and we're just gonna loosen each side a little bit at a time and give it a bit of a wiggle. And you see how the spring just pushed it up tight against the bolts again? That's what we wanna see. If you don't see that, you might need to bump the engine over. The trick is there is a foot on the bottom of this pump, and if that foot falls down, doesn't come out with a pump, that's a problem. So if the cam lobe isn't stopped in a good spot, you won't see this kind of push up. And so here we're all the way loose, so I can just go ahead and take these bolts all the way out. Obviously, when you do this, be careful to not drop bolts down into the intake, because bolts in the intake is always a recipe for disaster. And then we're just gonna kind of wiggle front to back while pulling up on it. Okay, so I'm using this it's a long reach body trim tool. And this is from Snap-on, but you can get this from Harbor Freight or anywhere. It's just this angle on the bottom, and I'm gonna go underneath and try to pry between the engine block and the fuel pump to kind of encourage it up. The other tool that works really well here is like a crow's foot pry bar or a lady's slipper pry bar. There's a bunch of different words for them. I've got a review. I'll post that link right there in the top of your screen to a really good option if you're interested in buying that tool. But the trick is to just gently pry up on this thing and coax it out. What's hanging us up here is the O-ring that seals this into the engine block. Just gonna make sure that our fuel lines in the back are not, yeah, okay, we're good. Right, so the fuel lines in the back have come separated, because if those don't separate, those can also hang you up. Okay, so I'm not getting a whole lot of success with that long tool, so I'm just gonna use a short flat blade screwdriver here. We're gonna come up and we're prying. Again, we're prying as close to straight up as we can. So I'm gonna hold the pump up, and then we're gonna use the screwdriver to pry between the engine block and the ears of this pump. We don't obviously wanna break the pump off in the hole. There we go. So once it pops up past that O-ring, we wanna just come straight up and out. And there's the pump. And this O-ring is what was hanging us up there. So when this O-ring gets saturated with fuel, it swells, and you get that kind of stickiness. And this is the foot that I was talking about. This foot is not attached. It just sits in there. And so if that foot drops into the engine, that's bad. If the cam is high enough, it won't go anywhere, but you wanna make sure it comes out with that foot. If it doesn't, you gotta find a plan B and figure out how to get that foot out of there, which usually requires pulling the engine oil pan, which requires the engine to come out, and you just don't want that to happen. So be careful pulling it out. Every time I pull one of these out, the foot comes out with it. So this is the fuel pump that we're putting in. We're going with a Carter fuel pump. Carter's been making fuel pumps for these things since forever, and this is typically the best bet. The reviews on Amazon are kind of mixed, but as a professional, I've been using these for better part of a decade, and they work really well, and they're pretty cost effective. I want to say this one was like 65 bucks. I'll put a link in the description if you guys are looking for it. Again, we can see the foot is there and the O-ring is there. And then this is the important part, is it comes with these two little aluminum washers. These washers go on the banjo bolt to the back. So we have to reach down in there and switch them out. The most difficult part of this job is once this pump is installed, holding this washer between the fuel line and the pump and then starting the bolt through it. That's the challenging part that is just gonna take some time. So if you're struggling with it, there isn't really a secret or a secret method. It's just a matter of trying it until you get it. In the valley, I'm gonna pull out, this is that banjo bolt that I was talking about, and then here we can see the seal. This goes, so you're gonna put one seal on the bolt, and then that's gonna go through the fuel line, I guess manifold in the back, and then there's another seal that seals it to the pump. So you gotta make sure when you're doing this that you get the old seals off So there's the old front seal. So we've got 2 old seals that are coming off, and then we've got 2 new seals that are going to be going back in. So typically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the first seal on the banjo bolt, and then I'm going to start it, just kind of hang it through this, kind of like that. So as you can see, the bolt is in there, and it's hanging, it's not sticking through at all, and it's just going to sit right there. Some of these have a little metal tab that you can just set your new seal in there, and these little side tabs will hold it. They don't all. This one has it, so it should be a little bit easier. And then I'm going to poke that bolt through just enough to where it'll catch that washer if I should bump it. So the bolt's all the way out. We're just enough through to hold the washer, and now we're going to go in with a pump. So it's really important when you're doing this to lubricate this O-ring going in. I'm using this assembly goo. Engine oil works. Grease would work. Dielectric grease would work. Just about any kind of a lubricant that will lubricate this O-ring. And so we just want that O-ring to slip down into that hole without cutting or tearing. I'm also going to get a little bit on my glove here and just go into the hole and lubricate the hole as well. That way we have the maximum chances of success with this. And so for this, we're just going to want to make sure that we push it in straight down. I'm just going to go in very carefully. I'm just going to kind of rock it a little bit and then push down. And you'll see down here there's a little bit of a gap between the manifold, or between the fuel pump and the engine block. That's normal. When we put the bolts in, we're just going to want to work this thing down a little bit at a time. So we're going to tighten the bolt on that side, and then we're going to tighten the bolt on this side and bring it down nice and straight. If you tighten one side down all the way, you could break the ear or twist the body of the pump or crack the body of the pump. It's just, don't do that. So always start these bolts by hand. So just put them in, spin it down until it starts to get tight. Do the other side. If I can get my hand in there. If you're having trouble getting your hand on the actual bolt, but you still want to start it by hand, you can use an extension and then just use your hand to twist the extension. The big thing we don't want to do here is put a tool on it that could potentially cross-thread it. So once we've gotten a turn or two out of it and we're confident that it's going in straight, then it's safe to put a ratchet on it and continue to tighten it. When you're starting a bolt like this, if you find that it gets hard within the first couple of turns, stop. You're probably cross-threaded. You need to go back in straight. So I'm just going to snug this down until I see the body of the pump start to move as we're sucking it down. So very just light 2-finger touch on the ratchet, and there we start to see the pump body move. So I'm going to pause on that one. We're going to jump to the other side, and you can see that this bolt is completely loose. So we're going to go ahead and we're just going to go down. We're going to look for a little bit of that pump body movement, and then we're going to go back to the other side and just gingerly work this thing down, going less than a turn, half a turn or so on each bolt as we work this thing down. You cannot be too cautious doing this step. If you turn a quarter of a turn or a sixth of a turn each, you're not going to hurt it, but you can hurt it if you pull too much on one side. So there's a ditch on one side of the road in this case, and that is if you suck one side down all the way before tightening the other side down. So now we're getting to where we're tight. So I'm going to go ahead and apply kind of a final torque to these. I do not have the spec off the top of my head, but basically pretty snug with a 3/8 drive ratchet is what we're looking for here. This pump does take some vibration, so you definitely want these bolts to be tight. And we're steel bolt into a cast iron block, so they can take a good amount of torque before breaking, but obviously we don't want to break them because that makes life a lot worse. And then that's the pump installed. Okay, so now is the most challenging part of the repair. We're going right down here. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to visually look, and I'm going to see that the washer is still in place between this fuel line here. You can see there's this round kind of ring and the fuel pump body. So all of our washers are in place. And so it's going to be kind of hard to see when my hand goes in because that's the only way to do it. But we're going to push the that bolt forward and then turn it until we can start the threads going into the fuel pump body. Again, this is the hard part. And I've done this repair plenty of times, and it's still challenging, so don't feel bad if you're struggling with this. They're big, coarse threads, and so they will, when you get it lined up, it will start easily. Sometimes you have to lift the bolt or the body of the fuel pump up and move it around a little bit. Just keep constant tension on the banjo bolt so you don't drop that washer. So I got it started a couple threads, and what you should always do is as soon as you start it, look back in here, double check that your gasket between the fuel line assembly and the fuel pump didn't fall out, so we can clearly see that both of our gaskets are still in place. So we're going to keep working this thing. I'm going to spin it as far as I can by hand, and then we'll put a wrench on it and tighten it up the rest of the way. So one thing I do want to point out is that I did have to lift this fuel line assembly. So if you kind of cradle it with your fingers and then just pull it up a little bit while keeping tension on the bolt, you'll feel it kind of pop and it'll drop into the end of the fuel pump, and then you just spin it and get it in. So we are finger tight there. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that wrench that we had, and we're tightening this up the rest of the way. All right, so again, we're just using this wrench, and we're just going a little bit at a time. So this is a right-hand thread bolt, so the correct direction. So rightsy-tightsy, leftsy-loosey. So with this wrench, when you have it on the bolt, pulling it towards the passenger side is tightening, pulling it towards the driver's side is loosening it. So make sure you're pulling it the right direction, because if you're not, you're gonna have a bad time. So these are flat aluminum or steel washers that seal this, so this bolt needs to be pretty tight, and you also don't want it to come out. So we're going to apply quite a bit of tension onto that wrench. All right, and that's what we're going to call it good. So for most people, that's going to be almost as tight as you can get it with this wrench pulling in. So if you reach over the passenger side fender, kind of like I am here, you can get something to brace your body against while you're pulling on this, and you've got the fender to pull against, and then you can actually get some torque on this thing. It's going to be much easier to do this reaching over the passenger side fender than trying to come over the hood or over the front. So this is a great time to take a moment and clean the excess fuel out of your engine valley. What we don't want to do, so I'm just using regular brake clean. You can pick this up at any auto parts store. What we don't want to do is get that inside of the fuel system. So I'm going to reach down here with my finger and cover the bottom port of this while I'm spraying. And we're going to try to rinse this fuel out of the valley. It's kind of hard to tell if the fuel that's leaking into the valley is new fuel or old fuel. So again, I'm being careful to not spray those ports and just kind of hose down all this area. And then I'm also going to come in and hit kind of behind the fuel pump. So all of this fuel is going to run out. There's a drain at the back of the valley. So if you just put enough volume of cleaner into here, or if you have a pressure washer, is another great tool to push some of this stuff out. But the trick is to not get water or cleaner or anything into any of the fuel ports or into the intake ports. So if you've used brake clean, if you have access to compressed shop air, use that to blow dry all the valley. I don't have that here because I'm at home. Just take a rag and kind of soak up any of that excess cleaner so that it's not sitting there when you go to start the engine, and so there's no confusion about. So like now we don't have a puddle of liquid in there. I'm gonna try to reach and do a little bit of the same thing behind the turbo. The goal here is to be able to see clearly that the valley is clean and dry, and then after we're done with the repair, we can verify that repair by driving the truck and rechecking the valley, and if it's clean and dry, we've fixed our leak. So whenever you're doing this repair, you're already here to have these line sections off. So I'm going to go ahead and replace them. There are 3 of these sections. This is the short one that goes from our supply into our fuel pump. I already popped it off. You want to use transmission oil cooler line. Ask for it at any auto parts store. They can get it for you. This is going to be the line that stands up the best to diesel fuel. And that's obviously what's flowing through here, so we want the best quality line that'll stand up to this. This line's about 8 years old from when I did this job last time, and it doesn't feel too bad, but we're here, everything's apart. There's no better time to change these lines than here, and these are super common to leak if you still have the original Ford lines. So the 3 lines going into the pump are going to be 3/8 lines, and this little section going from the regulator return back to the tank, this is going to be 5/16. So you need a total of like 6 inches of 3/8 tranny cooler line and about 1.5 inches of 5/16 tranny cooler line. So we like to use these worm clamps. If you still have the factory clamps and they haven't been swapped out, this is a great time to swap out your clamps as well. So I'm going to go ahead, and what I do with these is I just take this section of hose, I take it off, I line it up in my bulk hose, trim it to length, and put it on. Nothing really fancy about what we're doing with that. Okay, so I went ahead and trimmed up our new section of line that's gonna go in here. When you're doing this, what you wanna do is make sure your hose is all the way on to the inlet side of the pump, and then tighten this down. If you install these clamps with a long extension like this, then they're oriented easily to come back and take them apart later. So don't struggle to try to put the head of the clamp somewhere stupid. Put it in the easiest spot to get to, and it makes it easier. So now we tighten this clamp up. This clamp is still loose, and we're just gonna kind of work this line on the side a little bit. And we wanna make sure that the metal on the end of this line is not touching the metal on the end of this nipple. So we just wanna see a little bit of movement in that hose. We don't wanna pull it back too far, but you can kind of feel if you squeeze the line. It's hard to see on camera, but there's a little lump right here, which is the lump at the end of the nipple, and I can feel there's a gap between the two lumps. And if I move it around, I can feel that they're not dragging. So that's where we want to set our depth for this guy. And then once that's set, we'll go ahead and tighten that clamp up. Whenever you're using a ratchet like this to tighten up these clamps, you got to be careful because you can apply way too much tension and you'll break the clamp. So I'm just looking for a little bit of squeeze of rubber through the gaps in the clamp right there. And just like 2 fingers barely on a ratchet is all you need. You want to just show my hand? So I'm just applying just a tiny, like literally I'm using my thumb and 1 finger and just a tiny bit of pressure right at the bottom of the wrench, and that's all you need. And it is plenty tight, it won't leak. Okay, so on this fuel bowl, we're gonna change these 2 lines out. There's also a line right here that runs up. This one is impossible to change without taking this bowl out. And these lines are also, you gotta take the bowl out to change the lines. So if the bowl's already out, we should be changing these at a minimum. I changed this one not that many years ago, so I'm gonna go ahead and leave it alone. Also, I don't have enough hose here to do that one. But these ones, because we're manipulating them and they're kind of moving as we're putting this fuel bowl into and out of the truck, we definitely want to make sure we change these. The orientation of this bottom hose clamp does not matter because we're always going to take it off at this end. So the orientation of the front clamp is what matters when we put it together, not so much the bottom clamp. So the way these pumps fail is there's a diaphragm inside of here, and this is the weep hole at the bottom, where when that diaphragm ruptures, fuel leaks out of here. They can also leak around this crimp at the top. That's not super common, but what you're looking for is, as the way this thing sits in the vehicle is this way. So over here on what's going to be the passenger side, as you're looking down into the valley, this hole, you'll see a spraying of fuel when you bring the engine RPM up. So if you're looking for a leak and this is in the truck, we're looking kind of in this front corner area, bring the engine up about 2,500 RPM, and you're looking for fuel squirting out of here or fuel leaking around the rim of the crimp right there. But that's kind of what goes wrong, and you can see this kind of dirt build up right around there. So this is kind of the area that our fuel leak was in. Everything is all covered in fuel here, so it's hard to pinpoint for sure what the failure point was, but this is the piece that generally leaks other than the fuel lines like we just talked about. All right, so we got our new hoses installed and we're tightening the clamps on the fuel bowl side. We're leaving these clamps in the front loose, and then we're gonna go ahead and shoehorn this guy down in. When we put this in, dripping a little bit there. When we put this in, we're gonna wanna put our hose on this drain valve first. If you have not replaced the O-rings inside of this drain valve, you're gonna wanna replace them now. It's just 2 screws, really easy to get to. I replaced these recently, so that's why I'm not going after it right now. And yeah, let's put this thing in. All right, so again, I'm coming in here with kind of a laser focused approach as far as the fuel leak, because I've already done everything else around this job somewhat recently. But if you hadn't done that, this would be a great time to take your fuel filter out and change that, and then clean out the bottom of the bowl. So there is still fuel in this housing because I haven't taken the filter out. So we are gonna see some leakage, which is gonna make a mess in the valley. We'll have to clean that again. When you're putting this in, this pigtail for the IPR is gonna be the first thing that you connect, because it's really hard to reach once the fuel bowl is installed. It's way down here on the high pressure pump. If I can get it in there. Okay. So that's where that wire goes. It just goes right down to that regulator. And then we're just gonna kind of shoehorn this guy in. Yeah, there goes all that fuel right into the valley. Okay, well. Sometimes if you climb up onto the truck so you can kind of look straight down it, that works a little better. And we're gonna hook the first hose. I'm just gonna kind of push the first hose on. And then I'm gonna reach down and I'm gonna get the drain hose lined up. So now the drain hose is on, and then I'm just going to walk that bottom hose. And there's the bottom hose on, and we're all of our hoses are in place. It's still sitting there, it's loose, you can see. So before we tighten up these hoses, we're gonna want to put the bolts in. The bolt is fuel bolt down, so any amount of slack in the hoses that needs to be there can be there without applying any undue tension to these hoses. We do, forgot about this guy. This guy's gotta go on. And you just kind of pop it over. And again, same thing, we want to make sure that this metal line coming up isn't in contact with the metal up in here, because if they're in contact, they can rub and then put metallic debris into your fuel system, and that is not a thing that we want to have happen. So now all the lines are connected, we're going to put the bolts in that hold the fuel bolt down to the engine block. So again, we're just going to snug with a 3/8 ratchet. It doesn't need to be crazy tight, but you do want it to be snug enough that it doesn't come loose. Then we're going to plug in our electrical connector here on this side. Mine's missing the lock tab, but it should click into place when it's normal. That's that guy right there. That's all the electrical stuff going down the back. And then we got to reconnect these fuel lines. Again, trying to be as gentle with them as we can. If you fold them up out of the way, there's a good chance they'll burst on you, unless they're fairly new. Just start it by hand and do your final tightening with that 9/16 wrench. Typically, I do both of them. I start both of them, and then I'll tighten both of them with a final torque. There's both on there tight. These are brass flare fittings, so these need to be snug, but not super tight. Just a little bit and if you go too tight, you can break these brass elbows, and that's not good. Again, being careful about the sensors that are around here so we don't break anything. A little snug, and that's perfect. Now, once the bowl is secured, we're gonna go ahead and tighten up all of our hose clamps on our fuel lines. Starting with this little vertical 5/16 fuel line here. Now, especially on this one here, this doesn't need to be crazy tight because this is a return line. There's very little pressure in here. And then we've got our two hoses going down onto the fuel pump. Again, we're going to use that long 1/4" extension to get down onto those. We want to make sure that those clamps are oriented facing up. And so typically what I'll do is I'll just kind of hold them where I want them and then put on that socket and snug it down. You want to make this as easy as possible to come back, because even if you do everything right, these parts still wear out and you might have to do it again. So I oriented the bottom one pretty well on the front end, so we should be able to just go right onto it and tighten it. If not, a long screwdriver is often easier to get down to that hole than, say, your hand. Just gonna snug it up. Again, we're using a pretty big lever arm on a worm clamp that's very small. If you go too tight, you'll damage the clamp and it won't hold as tightly. So now that all of our lines are on and we spilled a bunch more fuel in the valley, we're gonna wait to clean it up because we still have to prime the system, which means that we're gonna let some more fuel into the valley before we're actually done here. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the intake elbow back on, and I'll show you the trick to doing that in just a second. So the trick to getting this elbow on, what seems to be the easiest method, is to take this boot off and put this boot on the engine first, and then push this one on and then slide that down into there. Now, these boots need to be clean and not all oily for that clamp to hold. So brake clean onto a rag, and then just take that rag and kind of wipe out the sealing area so it's nice and clean like that. You don't want any oily residue. I'm also going to do that on this side. Some oil in this pipe is normal. Don't be worried about it. It's just got to be cleaned off of that sealing surface before we put it together. The other trick is to making sure that this seal goes back into the turbo like it should. I use this assembly glue like we used on the O-ring. Works really well. This is a firm tack, so the green stuff. And you can put this on here, and then when you put this onto the engine, it's sticky enough that it holds that O-ring in place while we're putting this together. Now, when this stuff gets hot, like when your engine is, running, it is going to turn back to a liquid. It's not going to hurt the seal, but you might see a little dribble of green. That's why I like using this stuff versus other stuff, because that's the only green fluid this engine's gonna leak, is that assembly lube. So now I'm gonna put this clamp, or this boot, on the intake. I'm not gonna push it all the way flat. I'm gonna kind of kick it up a little bit like that, making sure these clamps are oriented to where I can get to them. And then I'm gonna push on the left side and kind of shoehorn it down and in just like that. So I'll show that again from another angle. This boot, you just tip up a little bit and then shoehorn it down, and it slides in and everything goes like you should. Once you're to this point, the next step is we want to put the clamp on this portion before we put the clamp on the soft boots. So again, you can kind of pull it back and make sure your seal is still in place, and it is. I'm going to apply some forward pressure to that. And then I'm going to tighten this clamp up first, because this is a hard connection and these are soft connections. We want to anchor this first so we don't put undue stress on the lower boots. Again, I'm doing this with a power tool, but you don't need a power tool. You can do this with a flathead screwdriver. It's just a little bit easier with a power tool. So once you start it, double check that you're square. And then this clamp will kind of center this piece where it needs to be, and then you can adjust your clamp. So now this is anchored in, so we just got to tighten the clamps up here. Again, using the power tool, you don't need a power tool. You can do this with a 1/4" ratchet, same way as we did with those fuel lines. If you over tighten these, you'll see them start to squish. So if I over tighten this one, this will try to slide off and go down. So if you see it start to move, that means you need to clean your boot and your clamp is too tight. Do the same thing, just snug that guy down. See how that just moved up like that? Not supposed to do that. So that means it was too tight and there was still a bit of oil residue. So we just loosened it up and then snugged it like it should be. So now this repair is done, the only thing left is to prime the fuel system, which in this case, we're gonna do this a little bit backwards. In an ideal world where you were doing a fuel filter service as well, you'd have this cap removed and we would crank the engine until we saw the fuel bowl start to fill with fuel. Then we put the filter in, put the cap back on, and crank till it starts. Because I'm not changing the fuel filter today, we haven't taken this cap off. There's still a lot of fuel in the bowl, but there's still a good air pocket that we have to work out from the fuel pump. This little Schrader valve here on the side, it's got a little plastic cap on it. And then if you take a screwdriver or a pick and you push the little center of it in there, that will allow the air to escape after we're cranking. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna crank this thing for about 10 to 15 seconds, and then I'll come out here and push this straight above and we'll let that air escape. We'll do that a couple times and it should start right up. For the sake of showmanship, okay, so sometimes it'll just start. And that works too, but it's probably gonna die when it hits the air pocket, but we're just gonna run it anyway and see what happens. I'm gonna bring the engine RPM up slightly to try to work through that air pocket. Alrighty. Okay, so I have an update for you. If you do this without replacing the fuel filter, you don't need to worry about priming it. It just starts up on its own. So what I did there was I elevated the engine RPM to try to work through that air pocket. I am going to go ahead and push the Schrader valve and let any air out that it's made its way up to this point. Yep, got a little hiss of air, and then we're into fuel. So we should be good to go. So now at this point, now that we're done dumping fuel into the valley, we'll go ahead and finish cleaning it. I'm going to use probably a can or two of brake clean to hose this thing out. If you've got a pressure washer with some soap, you can pressure wash this whole area. You don't want to get too close to some of these sensors because they are waterproof, but they're not waterproof at 3,000 PSI. So, but you can get all down here. If you can get a pressure washer wand like down into these gaps into the valley, there's nothing down there that's going to get hurt by that water, and you can rinse this out and get it all nice and clean. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up here. We've completed this repair. I still have some cleaning to do, but I'm going to do that off camera because it's not exciting and you don't need to know how to clean an engine. This repair start to finish was about 1 hour and 10 minutes for me. Obviously, I had all the tools. I knew what size every bolt was and where everything was going. But if you've watched this video, you should now know that information too. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like, a thumbs up so that it can spread to more people, and we'll see you guys in the next video.